All right, so resuming the daf with the new parak, Elu Dvarim, 6th parak of Masechet Pesachim, and we're starting on Samach Amud Bet, even though today's daf is Samach Vav. Elu Dvarim b'Pesach dochin et Shabbat. The Mishnah says these are the elements of the Korban Pesach that override Shabbat. Now, what's the issue? The Korban Pesach is not brought on Yom Tov. Okay, the Korban Pesach was actually brought the day before the Yom Tov. We know that because when was the Korban Pesach brought? The day that we have to stop eating chametz is the day that they were bringing the Korban Pesach. So if that day falls out on Shabbat, what we call Erev Pesach, Shachal b'Shabbat, right? The years that we have to eat really early in the morning and get rid of all the chametz because it's Shabbat, and we have to pray really early on Shabbat morning and all that. So that those years is this situation. The Korban Pesach is being brought on Shabbat. And the question is, what elements of it override Shabbat? Now, why is it a question? Normally we bring Korbanot on Shabbat, right? But here, the Korban Pesach is a little bit different. Because we offer the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, meaning we slaughter it, we put the blood on the Mizbeach, the altar, we put the fats on the Mizbeach. But then, we don't actually roast the Korban Pesach immediately. We don't have to. In other words, the roasting is not part of the Korban.
What is
Roast, tzli. No, it's lotet Korban. Right, we do that separately. In other words, you can do that at night. You don't have to do that right away. So, even though you need to bring the Korban Pesach on the proper day, which is Shabbat, you're not going to eat it until Saturday night at the Seder, right? So you don't really need to roast it. You don't need to cook it, the meat. So the Mishnah is going to figure out which aspects of Korban Pesach override Shabbat, are doche Shabbat, and which ones are not. So the Mishnah says these,
In our last few days, there were talks about where we do the Korban Tamid, B'narbaim. After this, there was a lot of argument back and forth, but I'm not sure, is it done after or before?
It's done after. Yeah. So, Shachitato uzrikat damo. So the slaughtering of the Korban Pesach, shachita, obviously has to be done on the proper day. Zrikato, throwing of the blood on the Mizbeach, obviously has to be done on the correct day. That is the hakrava, that's the actual sacrifice. Michui keravav. Michui keravav means cleaning the inner organs, the internal organs of waste. Because what will happen if you leave it there? It will become putrid. It will become disgusting, right? So, however, and v'haktarat chalavav, and obviously taking the chalavim, the fats of the korban, and putting them on the mizbeach. So we could summarize this by saying that anything which is really part of hakravat korban, the actual offering of the korban, has to be done on Shabbat. We have no choice. The only exception is the cleaning of the intestines. That's not really part of the hakravah. But we'll see why you have to do that. However, aval tzliato, roasting, v'hadahat keravav, and washing out the internal organs, not just removing the waste, but actually washing them out, enan dochin et Shabbat. They don't override Shabbat. Why? Because you can do them Saturday night. You can do them on Yom Tov when you're going to eat the korban. You don't have to do them on Shabbat. Harkavato v'hava'ato michutz latachom v'hatichat yivolto. Similarly, if you need to transport the korban to the Beit HaMikdash, harkavato, in other words, to carry it, you want to carry your sheep is too tired to walk, you want to carry it, or hava'ato michutz latachum, you have to bring it from outside of the techum, outside of the 2,000 amma limit that you're allowed to walk. You need to bring it to Jerusalem, obviously, to the Beit HaMikdash. Let's say you have to go outside, you're coming from outside the Techum. So can you violate the rules of Techumin on Shabbat to bring your Korban? Can you carry an animal on Shabbat to bring your Korban? What about if you need to cut, it has a wart on it, Yivolto. Yivolto is Yabelet, it says in the Torah. If it has a wart, right, it has a wart on its body, you can remove it, you can cut it off and make it kasher as a Korban. But can you do that on Shabbat? Can you take off the Yabelet on Shabbat? So the Mishnah says, En dochinet Shabbat. So let's say you forgot. You should have brought your sheep to the Beit HaMikdash before Shabbat. You forgot. Now you're outside the Tchum. Should have carried it before Shabbat. Should have cut off the yabelet before Shabbat. You didn't do it. You can't do it on Shabbat, according to the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer.
Because to slaughter you can do it until.
You're right. Now hold on to that thought. He's as smart as Rabbi Eliezer, because that's what Rabbi Eliezer is going to say. Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Tochin. Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, it is. You can come from outside the Tuchum, you can carry the sheep, you can cut the yabelet, all of it. Amar Rabbi Eliezer says exactly what Yossi says, what our Rabbi Yossi says. What does he say? V'alo dinhu, it's logical. Ma im shechita, shehi mishum melacha dochat Shabbat. You're going to allow somebody to slaughter the korban on Shabbat. That's no problem. Mutar, mitzvah. However, elo shem mishum shivut. But you have these rabbinic rules. Cutting off the wart, pulling it off with your hands, it's not a deoraita. It's only asur midirabanan. The techum, most of the time, it's only derabanan when you come from the techum. Even carrying an animal, since chay noseh tatzmot could only be a derabanan in many cases. So you have cases where these are rabbinic prohibitions. Or muktzeh, whatever the problem is with carrying the animal. It's muktzeh maybe. Okay, so whatever the case may be, these are rabbinic prohibitions. Why shouldn't they override Shabbat? The shechita of the korban, shechita is av melacha. It's one of the 39 melachot you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And you're allowed to do that for korban Pesach. But you can't walk from outside the Tuchum, which is only a rabbinic prohibition. Rabbi Eliezer says, it's not logical. So, Amar Lei. So he said back to him, Rabbi Yoshua said to him, Yom Tov Yochiach. What do you mean, Rabbi Eliezer? I'll show you a proof. Yom Tov. Shehitiru bo mishum melacha, v'asuru bo mishum shivut. On Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook. You're allowed to do shechita. You're allowed to do all these things. Can you touch muktzeh on Yom Tov? No. You're not allowed to. So just because deoraita is allowed on Yom Tov, that doesn't mean derabanan is allowed. So just because certain deoraitas are allowed for Korban Pesach, doesn't mean the Rabbanans are allowed. Now what does he say back to him? Amar le Rabbi Eliezer, Maze Yehoshua. They were colleagues, so they talked to each other without the title. He says, what is this Yehoshua that you're giving me? What kind of logic is that? My ra'aya, reshut le-mitzvah. You're taking a reshut for mitzvah. Meaning, what does he mean? Means on Yom Tov, you can't touch muktzeh, it's asur midirabanan. You can't come from outside the techum, it's asur midirabanan, it's a rabbinic prohibition. You can cook, and you can do shechita. Why? Because it's part of Simchat Yom Tov. That doesn't mean you can do anything you want. But here, when it comes to Korban Pesach, just like shechita is necessary to do the Korban, so is bringing the animal. If you don't bring the animal, there's no Korban. Here we're doing a mitzvah. Your logic is not a logic. You're saying, on Yom Tov, there are things you're allowed to do that would on Shabbat be asur mideoraita. And yet, you're not allowed to touch muktzeh, you're not allowed to walk outside the tchum, that's only the Rabbanan. Rabbi Eliezer says, what are you talking about? You're not doing a mitzvah there. Here we're talking about where you're doing a mitzvah, Korban Pesach.
You're doing a mitzvah when you're cooking for
yeah, but that doesn't mean you can turn on the radio and listen to your favorite music while you're cooking on Yom Tov.
Oh, he's talking about the mitzvah of removing the wart. It's not to take.
In other words, he's saying that Rabbi Eliezer is saying all these things are necessary to bring the Korban Pesach.
Yeah, but all of this is necessary to bring to cook. In other words,
what's necessary to cook? What are you talking about?
Well, to cook, the comparison is still the same.
No, because Rabbi Yoshua is saying something else. Rabbi Yoshua is saying, because Rabbi Eliezer is saying, you don't make any sense, because if I can do shechita on the Korban Pesach, why can't I bring it from outside the Tchum? Right? And Rabbi Yoshua says, what are you talking about? Not every case where a deoraita is allowed is a derabanan allowed. Because on Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook, but that doesn't mean you can handle muktzeh or walk outside the Tchum. So the two are not the same. But Rabbi Eliezer's response is good, because Rabbi Eliezer says, you're comparing apples and oranges. Because on the Yom Tov case, what mitzvah is there in going outside the Tchum? None. What mitzvah is there in handling muktzeh? None. Here we're saying you need to violate these derabanans to get your Korban Pesach to the Beit HaMikdash on Shabbat.
The one Rabbanan, they don't hold it in a Hagdesh anyway, right?
What do you mean?
Whatever we have as Asur by the Rabbanim
Right.
in Beit HaMikdash, we're not.
That's true, but we're talking about people coming to the Beit HaMikdash. They're not there yet.
They're not in the big.
Right. So Rabbi Eliezer is saying what? The ends justify the means, basically, right? So therefore, whatever it takes, whatever violation is necessary to make sure the Korban Pesach is done, whether it's bringing from outside the Tchum, whether it's removing a wart from the animal, whether it's Shechita, it's all the same for Rabbi Eliezer. Whereas the other Chachamim said, no. The Hakrava itself is allowed. In other words, the sacrifice itself is allowed. That doesn't mean everything you need to do, drive up in your car on Shabbat with the Korban Pesach, because you need to bring it.
And that's consistent with all of the principles.
Right. But Rabbi Eliezer, throughout Shas, Rabbi Eliezer has the principle that machshirei mitzvah tochin et Shabbat. We learned about this in Masechet Shabbat. Brit Milah, he says you can cut trees down and make a fire in order to make a knife in order to do Brit Milah.
It seems to be opening the door to...
Yeah, no, because he maintains that it's not the performance of the mitzvah that overrides Shabbat. It's the fulfillment of the mitzvah that overrides Shabbat. In other words, so whatever you need to do to fulfill the mitzvah overrides Shabbat. Whereas the Chachamim say, no, only the performance of the milah is overriding Shabbat. Not anything you need to do to fulfill the mitzvah of milah. So here too, he's saying the same thing. Whatever you need to do is good.
That's different.
That's a difference.
It's a mitzvah. It's sakana.
That overrides anything.
Yeah.
Almost, yeah. That's the resort. Here we're talking about Korban Pesach.
Why not already on Shabbat?
That's another. I was just giving an example. I don't want to go into that.
We should, the rabbis, we should shitil.
Right. I don't want to go into that whole long discussion. All right. So now, what does he say back to him? Rabbi Akiva said back, Heshiv Rabbi Akiva v'amar haza'at tochiach. I'll show you a proof. Let's say a person needs to, he became Tmemet, okay? So that person, in order to bring the Korban Pesach, let's say on Sunday, needs to become Tahor because the seventh day of his Haza'ah fell out on Shabbat. Okay? So now what is he going to do? He needs to have Haza'ah, has to have the Para Aduma sprinkled on him on Shabbat, otherwise it's going to have to be Sunday, and if he does Sunday, now what's the problem? The same day that you become pure from the Korban, from the Para Aduma, you can't bring the Korban Pesach that day. It's Gzerat HaKatuf. You can't. So if we push off his Haza'ah, if we push off his purification to Sunday, he won't do the Korban Pesach. So we should do it on Shabbat then. If we do it on Shabbat, then it'll be good, and then tomorrow on Sunday you can bring the Korban Pesach. So he says, and you see though that we don't allow him to do the Haza'ah. We don't allow him to do the Para Aduma on Shabbat.
But on Shabbat, would that be a time that he would be obligated, or it would just be like, would he be obligated in that mitzvah on Shabbat?
What obligation? What? Which one?
Of bringing the Korban.
In this case, the obligation Sunday.
It's Sunday, so therefore he's not obligated.
But it's a machshirei mitzvah because he needs to do it in order to be able to do the Korban tomorrow. So why don't we let him do it on Shabbat?
That's a different story because then he's doing something.
But it's a good point though because he's doing something on Shabbat for later. That's true. It's different. But Rabbi Eliezer says a different answer. Listen to what he says.
If he went and let's say he found a Kohen that would do that,
right?
Would he be able
to? I suppose so. I mean, b'diavad it would probably be good, but yeah, he's not supposed to. What about it? Right? Yeah, you can't do the Korban Pesach. You have to be totally tahor to do it. I mean, in a Tevul Yom, it might be different in a Tevul Yom. Actually, I have to double check. A Tevul Yom for a 1 day Tumah, you mean? Might be different. For Tumat Met, there's a special Gezerat HaKatuv that the 7th day cannot be Erev Pesach. That's for sure. But a Tevul Yom of a regular Tumah, you might be able to do it because you're going to be able to eat it that night. Yeah. Bamigdash.
What do we mean?
They're saying that gezerot that the rabbis made, lest you come to do something else, are not enforced in the Beit HaMikdash. Because there's a sense that in the Beit HaMikdash, you'll have yirah already. You're not going to come to do a malacha on Shabbat. So if you play instruments, for example, you're not going to come to fix them because you're going to have the yirah that you're going to realize it's Shabbat. That's what it means. Gzerot that the rabbis made, lest you come to do something else. So the shavut is a gzerah midrabanan.
No, but slaughter.
That's different. That's because the korban overrides Shabbat. That's a different story.
So.
That's not a shavut.
What do you mean?
Shavut means specifically rabbinic prohibition. That's what it means. Yeah. So let's see what he says next. So he says, "She mishum mitzvah, vi mishum shavut, ve'ena dochat Shabbat, af atal titma al elu shafal pishen mishum mitzvah and mishum shavut lo yidchot Shabbat." So Rabbi Akiva's argument is, but Matthias points out a limitation in the argument, which is a valid point. But his argument is, look, here's a derabanan, a shavut, a derabanan of applying the, we're not talking about slaughtering the para aduma on Shabbat. Forget that. We're talking about putting the water on the guy on Shabbat. So you're not allowed to do it. It's an isur derabanan. And yet, we don't say, do it on Shabbat so that tomorrow you can bring the Korban Pesach. Now, Matthias pointed out the other issue. Well, it's not really analogous because in that case, the Korban Pesach is the next day. Fine. But the truth is, we don't allow the person to apply actually, you know what? Rashi says something different. Rashi obviously disagrees with the Rambam. Because Rashi actually says here, so that would get rid of your question. Right? That it's talking about where the Shabbat is Erev Pesach. So there will be a Korban Pesach that day. The Rambam says there's a Gzerat HaKatuv, you can't do that.
So in other words,
yeah, but right. So he has an obligation that day. So it answers the problem. Now this is a problem for the Rambam then.
Why there is no Gzerat HaKatuv with regard to the Hazah? Because it says Shiva Yamim.
Right.
Why there is no Gzerat HaKatuv there?
That you have to do it then?
Yeah.
It's telling you that it has to be done twice. It can't be before the seventh day, but it wasn't interpreted that it must be the seventh day. It could be delayed. But
That's very clear the way it should be.
Right, it's true.
Why don't we say that's Gzerat HaKatuv?
But it's like every other tumah. Even if you pass the period of tumah, you can always go to the mikveh later.
That's true.
Right.
But nevertheless, here you have specifically the Torah that you gotta do to the itself.
It also tells you for Tivul Yom at the end, at that one day you go, but that doesn't mean you have to go. You could go later.
Why don't we, again, the question is the principle. Why
Right.
some things you said that's Gzerat HaKatuv and other
Oh, that's a matter of Torah Shabbat Peh. Okay, I don't know. We don't always know so easily, but it's a good question. I mean, I don't know. So okay. So according to Rashi, according to the Rambam, you're going to have a bigger problem because according to the Rambam, on the same day that you get the seventh day Haza'ah, you can't also bring the Korban Pesach. But according to Rashi here, he doesn't have that problem. So he says that the seventh day is the same as the Korban Pesach day, and yet this person is not going to be able, to bring the Korban Pesach because he's not going to be able to, get the Haza'ah. He's not going to be able to have the Para Aduma splashed on him for that last day, and so therefore he's not going to be able to bring the Korban Pesach, and it's only an Isur D'Rabbanan, so why are you letting it stand in the way? So what does he say? So Rabbi Eliezer is not phased because Amar Rabbi Eliezer va'alea ani dan. You know what? I disagree with you on that too. I said that you could do the Haza'ah of the Korban of the Para Aduma.
Because of what Rashi says?
Yeah, he said that's a good point.
Because of what Rashi says, or because does Rabbi Eliezer agree with what?
Rabbi Eliezer is saying, you know what? I disagree with the premise. I say that if the Para Aduma, that if you need to have the Para Aduma sprinkled on you today so that you can bring the Korban Pesach today, you can do it.
Right.
Even though it's Shabbat.
But if we take the premise of Rashi, then the two are not comparable.
Why?
Right? Because he has an obligation.
But he has an obligation.
Whereas removing the word.
It's also an obligation because the Korban Pesach can't be brought without that.
He could not. But he could have done it before.
We could have done it before. Right, okay, that's a good point. Okay, good point. Fair point. Okay,
right.
Good point. Yeah.
With regard
True.
to the difference between Rashi and
Rambam.
the Rambam. What would the Rambam, I mean, basically the Rashi said we're talking about two different cases here. Okay, one says the 7 days is Pesach, and the other says
The Rambam would obviously not be able to say that because he holds that you can't do
what
that.
the Rambam saying that Rashi's
Well, the Rambam wouldn't have Rashi's case because the Rambam maintains that on the same day that you get that last Haza'ah, you cannot bring the Korban Pesach.
okay,
So I don't know how he would explain this.
Rashi say about the Rambam.
He just doesn't agree with him. He holds that you could.
No. So he holds that.
He holds it on the seventh, as long as you got that seventh day, that same seventh day that you got the Parah Adumah, you finished the process, you could also bring the Korban Pesach. The Rambam doesn't hold that. The Rambam holds it's a Gzerat HaKatuv of Tumat Met that you can't do that. Why? I don't know.
How about the Azah?
He would say you can't.
What do you mean you can't?
Can't do what? On Shabbat?
You can't do it on Shabbat. How can you bring the Korban Pesach the next day?
Who? According to the Rambam?
Yeah, Rashi.
What, the Rashi is saying it's the same day, it's on Shabbat.
Rashi says you're obligated to do it.
On the same day, yeah.
Right.
On Shabbat, yeah. So Rabbi Eliezer says, so he says that Ma'im shechita shi mishum malacha dochat Shabbat haza'ah shi mishum shavut eno den shidochat Shabbat. In other words, he says you're right. I agree with you. Whatever you need to do to be able to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, you do it. So if that means you need to do haza'ah, that means that you need to have the Parah Adumah splashed on you, even though you're not usually supposed to do it. Do it, because it can't be worse than shechita of the Korban Pesach. Okay, and now Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, "O chiluf." I could say the opposite. Ma im haza'ashi mishum shavut ena dochat Shabbat shechita shi mishum malacha eno din shelot tidchet Shabbat. He says, but what about the opposite? Maybe no. You're assuming the premise. Maybe I'll argue the opposite way. I'll say that just like you can't do the Parah Adumah ashes, they can't be sprinkled on you on Shabbat, so too you can't do the shechita of the Korban Pesach on Shabbat. But Rabbi Eliezer says to him, Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Akiva, come on. Akarta mashikadu b'Torah b'moado ben b'chol ben b'Shabbat. You're going to uproot the din of the Torah that says that you can bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbat. Why? Based on that logic, no way, can't be. So Amar lo Rabbi, he said to him, my teacher, haveli moed la'elu kamoed l'shchita. So that's really the essential response. Finally, we get to the essential response. What's the real machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Akiva is saying, Haveli moed, meaning everything you must do on Shabbat for the Korban Pesach, it's part of the Hakravat Pesach. That you can do on Shabbat. Anything you could have done before, removing the wart, transporting it, any of these things, could have been done before. Now, of course, Matthias mentions the case of Haza'ah. That's the one case that you couldn't have done it before, because the seventh day fell on Shabbat. Okay, so that we'll leave that as a question. But the general principle is, Rabbi Akiva says, Klal Amar Rabbi Akiva, Kol melacha she'efshar lasod erev Shabbat ena dochat Shabbat, shechita she'efshar lasod erev Shabbat dochat Shabbat. Anything you could have done before Shabbat, you can't do it on Shabbat. Anything you can do on Shabbat, anything you could only do on Shabbat, you must do it in order to do the Korban Pesach. Then you do it. It's like Brit Milah. You can't do anything for the Brit Milah on Shabbat that could have been done before Shabbat. But whatever is part of the performance itself, it has to be done on Shabbat. That's it. Now the Gemara says like this. This is a famous story about the Bnei Beit Terah. Bnei Beit Terah were the Nesi'im. They were the leaders. And they forgot the halakha. It came out. Shabbat was Erev Pesach. Hold on. Pa'am achat chal arba asar liot b'Shabbat. 14th of Nisan falls out on Shabbat. And what happened? Shachachu v'lo yad'u im Pesach dochet Shabbat im lav. They couldn't remember. Does Korban Pesach override Shabbat or not? Apparently they hadn't had it in many, many years, which it does come out very rarely. It comes out, sometimes a decade or two passes, you don't have it. So they didn't remember. Yeah. So what did they do? Amru klum yesh adam shodeh im Pesach dochet Shabbat. Is there anybody around we can ask this halachic question? Does the Korban Pesach override Shabbat? Im lav or not? Amrulo, they said to him, Adam echad yeshala mi Bavel v'Hillel bavli shemo. There's one guy who came up from Bavel, he made Aliyah, his name is Hillel. Ask him. Shishimesh shnei gedolei ador, Shemaya v'Avtalyon. He studied with Shemaya and Avtalyon. He served them for many years. He knows halacha. V'yodei im Pesach dochet Shabbat im lav. I guarantee you he's going to know the answer to the halacha. Shalachu v'kar'ulo, they summoned Hillel to come. Amrulo, klum ata yodeh im Pesach dochet Shabbat im lav. Do you happen to know, Mr. Hillel, what's the halacha here? Can we bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbat? Amar lahem, he said to them, V'chi Pesach echad yesh lanu b'shana shedochet Shabbat. Do we only have one Pesach per year that overrides Shabbat? There are more than 200 Pesachim that are override Shabbat. Why? Because every Shabbat you bring 4 korbanot. You bring Korban Tamid in the morning, 2 of Musaf, 2 Kvasim of Musaf, and Korban Tamid of the afternoon. And there's 52 weeks, but there's around 50 weeks in a year. You have more than 200 Korban Pesachs that you bring, meaning to say you bring Korbanot every Shabbat, and now you're asking me if you can bring Korban Pesach on Shabbat. What's the question?
But one is Korban Pesach and the other one is they're different.
True. So Amrulo, they said to him, Minayin lach. How do you know that it's analogous? Maybe Korban Tamid is absolute. Shabbat Korban, obviously it has to be brought on Shabbat. I mean, that's not a chidush. Amar Lem, he said to them, Ne'emar moado b'Pesach v'ne'emar moado b'Tamid. Ma moado ha'amor b'Tamid dochet Shabbat. Af moado ha'amor b'Pesach dochet Shabbat. He said to them, very simply, it's Gzera Shava. It says, L'hakrivli b'mo'ado, right? Right? You have to bring the Korban b'mo'ado in its proper time, meaning afilu b'Shabbat. And what does it say about Korban Pesach? Also, b'mo'ado. You have to bring this Korban b'mo'ado. So what does it mean? Just like Korban Tamid is brought on Shabbat, it overrides Shabbat. So too it says about Korban Pesach b'mo'ado in its proper time, even Shabbat. And ve'od kal v'chomer, it's also kal v'chomer. Why? Uma tamid shein anush karet dochet Shabbat. Pesach she'anush karet eno din shedochet Shabbat. When it comes to the Korban Tamid, if you failed to bring the Korban Tamid, what's the consequence? Nothing. It's bad, but you nothing. But the Pesach, it's chayav karet. Person doesn't bring Korban Pesach, it's very serious. So therefore, of course it's going to override Shabbat. So immediately, what happened? Miyad hoshivuhu berosh uminu nasi alehem. They made him the boss. They said, this guy knows what he's talking about. They elevated him to be the head of the community. All day long he was teaching Hilchot Pesach because he was the new leader. He came from obscurity to be, the leader. And he started dissing Bnei B'terah, saying what kind of slackers these are. What kind of people are these? He said, you know why I came all the way from Babylonia to be your ruler? To be the head over you? You know why? What was the cause? He says, because you were lazy. That's the reason. Because you guy, unlike me, I'm a great guy. I know. I was serving Shemayav Avtalion. I learned from him. But you guys, you lazy bum. It doesn't sound like his usual manner. Amrulo, they said to him, Rabbi, tell us. So that now they come with a question. Now, of course, whenever this kind of thing happens in the Talmud, the guy always gets his comeuppance right away. Right? So he's saying how these Bnei B'terah, they're lazy bums, they didn't serve, they didn't do. So what happens? Right, so they came with a question. What was the question? Somebody forgot to bring the knife. What if you need to bring your knife to the Beit HaMikdash on Shabbat? To bring the Korban Pesach, you forgot to bring the knife. So what do you do? So, Amar Lahen, he said, Halachazo shamati v'shachachti. He said, I know I learned this, but I forgot. So don't be such a big talker. Right. There you go. Ela hanachlen Yisrael, leave the Jewish people. Im en nevi'im hem, b'nei nevi'im hen. Let's see what they do. In other words, he said, even though they are not, if they're not nevi'im, they're the children of nevi'im, meaning they're going to know from tradition what they did. We'll observe what they did. And what happened? Lemachar, misha pischot teleh. Anybody who forgot to bring their knife, if his Pesach was a sheep, what did he do? Tochavo b'tzmaro, he put it in the wool of the sheep. He stuck it in the wool of the sheep, and the sheep carried it. And if the person's Pesach was a goat, goats don't have wool, they have regular hair. Tochavo ben karnav, he put it between the horns of the sheep, of the goat. So in other words, he used the animal to bring it. And when he saw that, Ra'ah ma'aseh v'nizkar halacha. He said, now I remember what the halacha was. That's exactly what I learned from Shemayav Avtalion, that when you forget to bring the knife, you let the animal carry it. Okay? Now, going back to the original Braita, Amar Mar, the master said, Nemar moda b'Pesach v'nemar moda b'Tamid. Ma moda b'amor b'Tamid dochet Shabbat, af moda b'amor b'Pesach dochet Shabbat. So just like we say, the word b'mo'ado in the Korban Tamid means in its proper time. That means that the Korban Tamid overrides Shabbat. Even though it's shechita, it's cooking, it's all these melachot. So too, Korban Pesach overrides Shabbat. V'tamid gufei minalan, tedache Shabbat. How exactly do we know that the Korban Tamid overrides Shabbat? Now, Ilema, if you're going to tell me it can't be the word moado itself. Why not? Because it says moado, bring the korban tamid in its proper time. And it also says about the Pesach, b'moado, in its proper time. Now, if the word moado by itself meant even on Shabbat, meant to override Shabbat, so then you wouldn't need to connect the korban Pesach to the korban tamid, because the word b'moado by itself would mean that it overrides Shabbat. So then that can't be the reason. That's just the connecting word between korban tamid, regular korban, and Pesach. But that's not the reason it overrides Shabbat. How do we know it overrides Shabbat? The answer is because ela moado lo mashmale. Okay, it's not the word moado. What is it? Hachinami moado lo mashmale. It can't be the word moado. So what is it then? Ela amar kra. The pasuk says olat Shabbat b'Shabbato. It says bring the olat Shabbat b'Shabbato al olat tamid. In addition to the olat tamid, meaning you bring the regular korban and you bring the korban of Shabbat. So just like the korban tamid is brought even on Shabbat, and it says b'moado, so too in korban Pesach, when it says b'moado, we connect it to the korban tamid and say even on Shabbat. So miklal. Okay, so therefore, what do we say? Ola de tamid kreva b'Shabbat. What does it say there? Yeah, but it's not. There's no Isur Malacha on that day, so it wouldn't teach us anything. Yeah, but it doesn't explicitly say that in the Torah. We only know that because of other Musafin. But we wouldn't know that from the Torah. The Torah itself doesn't say bring it on Shabbat.
No, but what I'm saying is there was a Kabbalah already. Rosh Chodesh you have, it comes.
Yeah, but he's trying to prove it. Yeah, but they're trying to prove it from Pesukim, though. They're trying to see where can you see from the Torah that it's true, and you see from the Torah that it says you bring the korban tamid on Shabbat. Musafin, you can infer from, for example, Sukkot and Pesach, because it says every day you bring the musaf. Rosh Chodesh, it never says even if it falls on Shabbat. Maybe you would have thought you can't, but we learn it from the other Musafin. So, what? Yeah, yes.
Rosh Chodesh said the same thing.
Yeah, but Rosh Chodesh is not Shabbat, so it doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah.
Right. So Amar Mar, the Braita further said, "Ve'od kal v'chol meramat michen anush karet dochet Shabbat, pesach shenush karet eno din shedochet Shabbat." That we said that if the korban tamid, which if you don't bring the korban tamid, the penalty is nothing. So that overrides Shabbat. So certainly korban Pesach, if you fail to bring korban Pesach, it's anush karet. The punishment is karet. So ikal mifrach. What kind of kal v'chomer is that? The korban tamid is every single day, and it's completely burnt on the Beit HaMikdash, on the altar. So how can you say a kal v'chomer? In other words, it's not a good kal v'chomer because you could say the korban tamid is stronger than Pesach. Pesach is a lower level of kiddusha. The korban Pesach is like a shelamim. It's a lower level of kiddusha because you eat the meat. It's not completely burnt, and it's not every day. It's once a year. So it doesn't have the same level of significance. It's not tadir. Usually they're brought voluntarily. So shlamim is of a lower level of kiddusha. It's kodashim kalim. I'm saying the korban Pesach is not tadir because it's only once a year. There are two ways a korban can be significant. One is it's tadir, and the other one is if it's a higher or lower qualitative level of kiddusha. Kodesh kodashim, haolah kodesh kodashim. We read it in Ezeh Umekoman, right? It's Kodesh Kodeshim. Shelamim is Kodeshim Kalim. Like the Pesach, it's Kodeshim Kalim. Because you eat the meat. So therefore, it's a lower level of Kedusha, and it's not as common. So you might think maybe it doesn't override Shabbat. So why is he bringing a Kal V'chomer from Korban Tamid? So the Gemara says, you're right. Kal V'chomer Amar Lehu Beresha. He first told them the Kal V'chomer. And what did they say? They say, Uparchua. They told him that's not a good Kal V'chomer. Because Korban Tamid is a higher level of Kedusha, so maybe just because it overrides Shabbat doesn't mean Korban Pesach is going to override Shabbat. So therefore, what did he do? And then he brought them the Gzerah Shava and said, no, the reason is because Korban Tamid is connected, is linked to Korban Pesach because of the word B'moado. It's not because of the logic that if Korban Tamid is going to override Shabbat, then certainly Pesach is going to override Shabbat because it's not a good Kal V'chomer. Because really, Korban Tamid is stronger.
Is he saying that the Kal V'chomer is made good by the Gezerah Shavah?
No, he's leaving the Kal V'chomer. He tried to convince them with the Kal V'chomer. He said, but I have another answer for you.
Okay.
Now, but then the Gemara asks, but wait a second. But V'chim Yachar the Gemara Gezerah Shavah. Kal V'chomer lamali. So if he had the Gezerah Shavah up his sleeve all along, why did he bother with the Kal V'chomer then? Right? Why did he try to prove it from logic then? So Ela Lididu Ka'amar lahu Bishlama Gezerah Shavah lo gamritu. So he said, I know that you don't accept this Gezerah Shavah, because if you had this Gezerah Shavah, you wouldn't have asked me the question. So I needed to prove it by logic. And when they said, well, we don't accept your logic, then he said, Den adam dan Gezerah Shavah me'atzmo ela Kal V'chomer da adam dan me'atzmo ibay lechu. The Medan. So he said, okay, I understand you're not you can only use a Gezerah Shavah if you received it as a tradition. I received it from Shemaya V'Avtalion, you didn't accept it. So I'll tell you a Kal V'chomer, which is logic. You can dan me'atzmo.
But it's not a good Kal V'chomer.
Right, so it's not a good Kal V'chomer. So they said it's not a good Kal V'chomer. So Amrullah, they said to him, Kal V'chomer perichahi. They said to him, that's a Kal V'chomer, a rejected Kal V'chomer. So he said, okay, then we'll rely on the Gezerah Shavah then. Accept the tradition that I have. Okay, so he gave them the logic because he thought, first we'll be on an even playing field. If somebody comes and says, oh, I have a secret tradition, it's this, it's that, you don't want to buy it. So he says, let me give you logic first. They said the logic is no good. He said, okay, well, the bottom line is I have a tradition. So they accept it. So now, Amar Mar, the master said, it said, the next day, the person who had a sheep, had a tlei, he had a sheep as his korban pesach, he put the knife in its hair, and it said bitzmaro, tochelo bitzmaro. Gedi, if he had a goat, so then tochelo bin karnav, then he put it between the horns.
It's very young.
Yeah, young. Yeah, they're the babies. So v'haka avid avodah b'kodashim. But wait a second. How can you use a korban to transport the knife? That's avodah b'kodashim. You're not allowed to make use of a korban. Me'ilah. You're not allowed to do that. So how could you do that? So the answer is ki Hillel, because it's according to the other position of Hillel. The Tanya, as we learned in a Baraita, amru alav al Hillel, miyamav lo ma'aladam ba'olato. That a person will never commit me'ilah with his korban. Why? Ela miviyah chulin la'azara, because what you do is you transport the animal when it's still chulin. You just bring your sheep to the Beit HaMikdash, and then when you get there, umakdisha, and immediately before you offer the korban, you say, this is the korban, v'somech yado alea, v'shochata.
He takes the knife out.
Right. In other words, so if you wanted to transport the knife, what you do is you put the knife in the hair. This is just a regular animal. You get all the way to the Beit HaMikdash, and then you take the knife off, and you say, this is my Korban Pesach, and then you slaughter it. So you never designated it until the last second. And Hillel was not just saying that for Korban Pesach, he was saying in general. Minimize the possibility that you're going to lean on the animal, you're going to do whatever. Don't declare it a Korban until you get there.
Why don't you take the second animal and put on the knife?
You could have done that too, I guess, but how many animals do you need,
Or bring your dog.
Bring your dog, yeah, but they didn't have dogs. All right, so he says, this is the way to do it. So then the question becomes, so he says, Pesach b'Shabbat hechi matzeh makdish lei. Right, so how can you consecrate the Korban Pesach on Shabbat? It's a separate problem. That works all the time. The rest of the year, you want to bring a Korban, don't designate it until the last minute so it doesn't have Kiddusha. Because once it has Kiddusha, if you lean on it for 1 second, you just committed a terrible Avirah. Because you used it, so you don't want it. So wait till you get there. However, Vatnan, en makdishin, ven ma'arichin, ven maharimin, ven magbiin, teruma, u'ma'asrot, kol elu b'yom tov amru, kal v'chomer b'shabbat. This is actually a Mishnah from Masechet Betzah. What does it say in Masechet Betzah? It says you can't consecrate a korban on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, you can't consecrate a korban. You can't do ma'arichin. Ma'arichin means you say the value, the erech of this person is on me. And the Torah tells you for different ages, the erech means a different amount that you're committing to donate to the Beit HaMikdash. You can't do erech, you can't be mahrimin, which means you take an object and say, I'm consecrating this chair, for example, to the Beit HaMikdash. You're not allowed to do that. Ve'en magbin truma u'masrot. You can't separate truma or maser on Yom Tov, and certainly not on Shabbat. So how can you tell me to bring my Korban Pesach over to the Beit HaMikdash? It's not a Korban yet, it's just fluff Fluffy the sheep. I bring Fluffy with me up to the Beit HaMikdash. We come in and I can consecrate Fluffy to be a korban in the Beit HaMikdash. How can I do it? It's Shabbat. How can I do it? So the answer is that that's only true. Hane milei b'chovot she'en kavod lehen zman. Aval b'chovot shekavod lehen zman makdishin. That's only true when it's not an obligation right now. In other words, you have a korban, you have an animal there. It's Yom Tov. You have an animal with you. You say, you know what? I want to bring a korban today. I'm going to consecrate this animal as a korban and go to the Beit HaMikdash right now. It's right around the corner. Can't do it. If you consecrated the korban from beforehand, you could do it. But you can't consecrate it on Yom Tov because it was, there's no fixed time. There's no obligation to bring this korban today. So only something that you consecrated, let's say, as a korban shilamim, you could bring it on Yom Tov and eat it on Yom Tov. But if you didn't consecrate it before, you can't. The korban Pesach, though, it's today. It's Shabbat, it's Erev Pesach, you have to bring it today. You can't say, I'm going to do it tomorrow. So you can consecrate it on Shabbat itself because the korban is today. As Rabbi Yochanan said, because he said that you can consecrate your korban Pesach on Shabbat, you can consecrate your korban Chagiga, which is the korban of the Yom Tov, on Yom Tov. So now we have another problem. So we're dissecting this, okay? First, we had the problem that how can you put the knife on the animal? It's going to be having the korban carry an animal, having this consecrated animal carry a knife for you. So the answer is we don't consecrate it till we get to the Beit HaMikdash. How can you consecrate in the Beit HaMikdash? You're not allowed to consecrate on Shabbat? No problem, because since the korban is today, you're allowed to. What about the fact that it's mechamer achar behemdo b'Shabbat? Meaning, so the answer is, mechamer means you can't use an animal to carry items on Shabbat. It says behemtecha, that on Shabbat your behemah has to rest, right? You're not allowed to use your animal to do work. What does it mean to use your animal to do work? If your animal can't eat grass out of the ground because it's kotzer, then it's going to die. It doesn't mean that. It means you can't use your animal to carry an item for you. So how can you use an animal to carry an item for you on Shabbat? The answer is it's kil achar yad. Okay, mechamer kil achar yad, which means it's not done in the normal manner, because sheep are not used as beasts of burden. Normally a sheep doesn't carry things, and certainly not stuck in its wool. A goat is not a beast of burden either, and definitely not stuck in its horns, right? So it's an unusual way of doing it. But the Gemara still asks, wait, but mechamer kil achar yad nami nehi de isura deoraita leka isura midrabanan mihaika. It's still asur midrabanan. You're not allowed to do things with a shinui in an unusual manner. Rabbinically, it's still forbidden. So how can you put the knife in have the sheep carry the knife for you on Shabbat? Anything with a shinui, anything you do in an unusual manner, is always only midrabanan on Shabbat. Any malacha you do in an unusual manner, it's midrabanan. You write with your teeth. You put the pen in your mouth, you write. It's midrabanan, it's not the normal way. But it's still asur midrabanan because they didn't want you to come to do it in the normal way. So with an animal, it's the same thing. It's midrabanan though. So how can you do it? How can you put the knife on the animal, let it carry? So the answer is because Hainu deka ba'e minei davar sheyesh lo heter min haTorah udvar shivut omed lefanav leokro kil achar yad b'mkom mitzvah mai. This is exactly what they were asking Hillel. If you have a situation where we know that you're allowed to do this min haTorah, and there's a rabbinic prohibition holding you back, and this rabbinic prohibition is going to prevent you from doing the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, can you override it or not? Amar lehen halacha zo shamati v'shachachti. That's exactly what Hillel was saying. That was the safek. Everybody knew you couldn't carry the knife in your pocket. The question was, can you do an isur derabanan if by refraining from the isur derabanan, you won't be able to fulfill a mitzvah from the Torah of Korban Pesach? And that was what he couldn't remember. And then when he saw everybody put the knife in the wool of their sheep or in the horns of the goat, he realized that was the halacha, he remembered it. Now we get a little bit of drash to end off for today, which is, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, Kol mityaher. Now this obviously is connected to what Hillel said. Hillel said, oh, you guys are a bunch of lazy guys, and I'm, that's why he didn't know the halacha. And of course he gets his punishment that he didn't know the halacha right after that. So what's kol mityaher? Anybody who holds himself arrogantly, okay, what happens to him? Im chachamhu, if he's smart, chokhmato mistaleket mimenu. Chokhmah is going to leave him. Im navihu, if he's a navi, nivuato mistaleket mimenu. He's going to lose his nivuah. Im chachamu chokhmato mistaleket mimenu mehilel. Where do we learn the story that if the guy is a wise person and he becomes arrogant for a moment, he's going to lose his wisdom? From Hillel. Because the minute that he starts saying, oh, you guys are lazy, and da-da-da, he forgets the halacha. Da'amar mar hitchil mikantran bidvarim. Right? That's what it says, that he started picking on them, and at that very moment that mikantran bidvarim, v'kamar lo halacha zo shemati v'shachachti. He forgot something himself. Im navihu nivuato mistaleket mimenu. How do we know that if a navi holds himself proudly, that he's going to forget his nivuah is going to leave him? Midvorah, we learn it from Dvorah. How so? Because she says, Chadlu perazon b'Yisrael chadelu. Right, that there was, that the people were not able to go out in the streets. In other words, she's talking about how the people were unsafe. They were terrorized by their enemies, and they weren't able to live securely. Ad shakamti dvorah shakamti em b'Yisrael. She said, until I came. Right, you guys. You couldn't solve the problem, but when I came, I solved the problem. So what does that mean? Uchtiv, and right after that, Uri dvorah, Uri dabri shir. Right after it says, wake up dvorah, wake up and sing. What does that mean, wake up? It means that she lost her nivuah. She was singing the song, and then once she started praising herself, you guys weren't able to, then she lost the nivuah, and it had to say, wake up again, get the nivuah back. And Resh Lakish Amar, Kol Adam shekoes. If a person gets angry, Im chachamhu chokhmato mistaleket mimenu. Im navihu nivuato mistaleket mimenu. Similarly to being arrogant, if a person gets angry, if they're wise, they lose their wisdom. If they're arrogant, they lose their. If they're a navi, they lose their nivuah. So how do we know this? Im chachamu chokhmato mistaleket mimenu mi Moshe. We learned this from Moshe Rabbeinu. How so? Dechtiv vayiktov Moshe al pigdei achai. Because he got angry when they came back from Milchemet Midyan. He gets angry with them. Uchtiv vayomer Elazar HaKohen al anshei hatzava ba'im lamilchama zor chukat haTorah asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe miklal de Moshe i'alam minei. That's a very famous thing, right? That Moshe Rabbeinu got angry with them for leaving all of the women alive from Midyan. And what happens? Right after that, he forgets to tell them the halacha of hechsher kelim and tevilat kelim. He forgets to tell them to make all of the things kosher that they captured from Midyan. And Elazar HaKohen has to come and tell them. Why? Because Moshe Rabbeinu forgot. Im navihu, if he's a navi, he's going to lose his nivuah. Mislakin menu me Elisha. We learn this from Elisha. Interesting story. Dichtiv lulei pnei Yoshafat melech Yehuda ani noseh im abit elecha v'mareka. Because he said he was angry with Yehoram, the king Yehoram. The king Yehoram was a bad guy. And he said, if not for the fact that Yehoshaphat is a tzaddik, because this was a time where Yehoshaphat was having, do you remember this? Sefer Malachim. Yehoshaphat and Yehoram, actually during the time of Yehoshaphat, Malchut Yehuda and Malchut Israel had an alliance together. They worked together. The kings were friends. The kings went to war together. They helped each other. There was a good working relationship. They had like a treaty with each other. And Elisha, though, had no respect for Yehoram. Yehoram was a bad guy, and Yehoshaphat was a tzaddik. Because Yehoshaphat, when they wanted to ask the Nevi'im, would say, don't you have a Navi of Hashem here? So in this case, so he says, Yehoram was the king of Israel. They were all bad.
But that's according to the Tanakh.
Right, of course, and it's also true. So he said to him, "Im abit elecha vim ereka." So he said to him, "I won't have anything to do with you. I wouldn't have come here if not for the king Yehoshaphat." In other words, he was insulting Yehoram. He was saying, "I wouldn't set foot in here if not for Yehoshaphat, because you, Yehoram, are no good." And so he was being aggressive. So what happens? Uchtiv v'atak yecholi minagen v'aya kenagen minagen v'atiya alav yad Hashem. But later on, when Elisha needs to get prophecy, what does he do? He has to bring a musician to play music because he lost his nivuah. He lost his nivuah because he got angry with Yehoram. So he needed to have the music to be able to get the nivuah back. Okay? And Amar Rabbi Mani Bar Patish. Rabbi Mani Bar Patish says, Kol shekoes. This is very interesting. This is the last piece. Anybody who gets angry, afilu posikin alav gidula min hashamayim. Even if they decided to give you a position of leadership, min hashamayim, they'll take it away from you. Moridinoto. They'll lower you if you get angry. How do we know this? Tichtiv, as it says in the pasuk. Minalan, where do we know this from? Eliav, the brother of David HaMelech. Eliav. Shene'amar, as it says, Vayichar af Eliav b'David, because it says that Eliav got angry with David. What was the story? David came down when Goliath was saying all those aggressive things. Oh, you guys nobody can fight me and all that. He was talking trash to the Jewish people. Shaul was waiting for some warrior to be willing to stand up against Goliath. He couldn't find anybody. And David came to bring provisions to his brothers who were in the army. His parents sent him. And meanwhile, he's looking and he's seeing this guy Goliath coming and saying all these things, and he's very upset. And Eliab sees his brother hanging around and says to him, what are you doing here? Lama ze yarata? Vayichar af Eliav b'David vayomer lama ze yarata v'alma natashta ma'atatzon ahena b'midbar. Why did you leave the few sheep that we have in the wilderness and come down here? This is not a show. I know your evil and your bad heart. You just came down because you wanted to see the spectacle of the war. You wanted to see a sideshow, so you came down. That's the only reason. Okay, in other words, he was angry at him. And what happens? Right, so when he comes down and he lines up all the brothers to decide who is going to be the Mashiach Hashem, who's going to be the chosen one, what happens? Ketiv lo bazeh. Right, and so when he sees, first it was actually, this is not the pasuk about Eliab, but it doesn't matter. Okay, when they brought Avinadav, and he said, Gam bazelo v'achar Hashem. Also this one Hashem didn't choose, right? So there are two pasukim. And then it says, Gam bazelo v'achar Hashem. The first one is Gam bazelo v'achar Hashem, Gam bazelo v'achar Hashem. So uve Eliav ketiv, and with Eliav it says, so in other words, the other brothers it says, this one wasn't the right one, this one wasn't the right one. But Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, with the first one, with Eliav, in other words, with the other brothers, it says, Gam bazelo v'achar Hashem. Hashem didn't choose this one, Hashem didn't choose this one. But Eliav, the first one, the oldest one, what does it say about him? Al tabit el mar'eu, don't look at his appearance. V'el gova komato ki me'astihu. And don't look at how tall he is, because I despised him. Me'astihu. Right? Yeah, but Eliav, Miklal dahvar rahim le ad ha'idana. What does that mean? That means that until now he liked him. In other words, to say me'astiu is different than saying lo bachar Hashem. If he said, I didn't choose this one, that means he never chose him. The other brothers, it just says, I didn't choose this one, I didn't choose this one. But Eliav, it says, ki me'astiu. I rejected this one, meaning he was chosen at some point and rejected. That's why it says, "Afilu poskin alav gedula min hashamayim." Eliav could have been the chosen one. They had chosen him min hashamayim, and he was rejected. Kimeastihu. Rashi points out that's somewhat out of order because the incident of the Meshicha, the incident of the anointing of David, was actually before the story of Goliath in the Tanakh. So Eliav hadn't shown his anger yet until later. But Rashi explains that Hashem knew, in other words, the heart of Eliav, that he was an angry person. That's why he rejected him. So he was chosen and rejected. And why was he rejected? Because he had the trait of a temper in him, and that made him unfit to be a leader of Klal Yisrael. And Bezrat Hashem will continue tomorrow.